All right, welcome back to the next episode of my NHL Deep Dive series. Today we are talking about the Stanley Cup runner-ups, the Edmonton Oilers. And this is a team that um, every year, basically the last couple of years, is going to be kind of in that Stanley Cup window because of McDavid and Draisaitl. And last year, obviously, they broke through and they finally got to the finals. They're down 3-0. They force a game seven, and they end up losing that game seven to the Florida Panthers. And it was really a tale of two series in that aspect because the first like three games of the series they were pretty bad, and then all of a sudden everything kind of flipped. Stuart Skinner turned into a god. McDavid had a crazy run, and they ended up forcing a game seven. They just couldn't get it done in that final game. But this offseason they were pretty aggressive, at least offensively. And we'll jump into the offseason moves. They bring in Victor Arvidsson, who I love as a fit for this team. Victor Arvidsson, I think, is perfect for like a Leon Draisaitl on that second line. Like he just perfectly fits that kind of mold, the kind of player that Draisaitl is going to have to play with. They also bring in Jeff Skinner, who again I think is a really nice winger for Connor McDavid. And we've seen Jeff Skinner have really good success the last couple of years, especially last year, not last season, but the season before in Buffalo. And I think that could be like that's fairly replicable uh playing with Connor McDavid. They bring in Matthew Savoie also in a trade, and Vasily Podkolzin from Vancouver, who I also really like kind of as a depth option. They lose Warren Fogle, Sam Carrick, Sam Gagner, Ryan McLeod, and Dylan Holloway. Obviously Holloway to the offer sheet. This group's pretty upgraded. Like even taking out Matt Savoie, who we don't know what he's going to be yet. Um, Arvidsson and Skinner are better than anybody they lost. And Podkolzin, at least now, is similar enough to Dylan Holloway. I think Dylan Holloway probably ends up becoming a better player, but for what they've shown so far, right? They're similar enough in talent, and obviously Vogel, Carrick, Gagne, and McLeod are just kind of depth pieces. So fairly easily upgraded unit there, even not considering what Matt Savoie could become for this team. Defensively is a bit of a different story. They bring in Josh Brown, who's not great. Um, he's probably not an NHL level defenseman. And Ty Emberson, who they get in the trade with San Jose, who I talked about in the San Jose video. So if you kind of want to see my thoughts on him, I think I talked about it in the San Jose video. I don't remember, but he was on the Sharks at the time. Um, they lose Desharnais, who ended up going to Vancouver. They lose Broberg, obviously, to the offer sheet, and Cody Ceci, who goes to San Jose in the cap movement there. And I like Cody. Cody Ceci is good enough as like a third pair defenseman. So they lose there. Cody Ceci is the best defenseman currently of that group. Broberg also obviously has a ton of potential, but he again, similar to Savoie, hasn't really played yet. At least in a significant role during the regular season. Obviously, Broberg had a pretty solid playoffs, but my ratings are based pretty much all on the regular season because there's more data. It's the whole thing. I can do a whole video on why the regular season matters more for player evaluation, but that's a whole other thing. Um, that's besides the point. The point is that even with the playoffs, Broberg still didn't play enough to really get rated. So yeah, it's slightly downgraded because Broberg's numbers didn't really affect it. So it's basically just Cody Ceci is the biggest loss there. And of course, they lose Jack Campbell as a free agent, which I don't think any Oilers fans are going to be too upset about. Jumping into this forward core, obviously they have the two A pluses, and hey, I was very tempted to figure out a way to make Connor McDavid on his own tier, but I didn't end up doing that because I felt like it was just the A plus tier is exclusive enough, but like clearly Connor McDavid is the best player in the A plus tier. But Leon Draisaitl is also really good, and I mean there's not much to say about these two guys. I mean everybody knows that they're awesome. Everybody knows Connor McDavid's the best player in the world. He proved it again in the playoffs last year. He probably had an argument to win back-to-back Conn Smythes, honestly. Like I could have made a pretty strong argument that he was the best player in the playoffs the previous season. Um, but regardless, he does win it last season. He's the front runner for the Hart every year. He's like one of the main reasons why the Oilers are going to be in contention every year that he's there. Obviously, Leon Draisaitl just signed a big deal as well. He's going to be there long term, and this dynamic duo is one of the best that we've seen in a long time. It's Crosby Malkin level. I think it's better than Taves and Kane just because Taves didn't have that elite dynamic offensive side that both these players do. But like it's Malkin Crosby level, right? Like that's what we're talking about here. And you have those two, you have a chance basically. And the Oilers have done a decent enough job, especially now, building around like offensively around these guys. I mean, Zach Hyman's kind of the third guy I have mentioned here. And he's an A minus because like last year was a pretty strong season for him, but it was also benefited because of playing with McDavid. Like his point totals were a little inflated because of that. So he gets the A minus here. He's a high A minus for me if I were to like rank everybody. But like again, have another strong season. He's moving up into the A's too, and this is still the third best offensive core in the league. So like, there's really not a lot to complain about with this offense. Clearly, Jeff Skinner, who I mentioned, I really think is going to be able to bounce back. He dropped to a B. He would have been a B plus last year. He dropped to a B. He had a down season. He's somebody who again I could see jumping up. And you look at the rest of this top six. I mean, Podkolzin, I think is a really good fit. I don't think the talent is like he's not he hasn't shown top six, like true top six upside yet, but the talent is good enough that I think he fits really well with that line. And he fits really well with like Arvidsson and Draisaitl. I think that as a third on that line, like he's the a very nice complementary player for that line. So although his rating is only a C minus, his fit on that line is very good. And obviously, you have Draisaitl, who's one of the best playmakers in the NHL. You have Victor Arvidsson, who's a very good scorer. It just kind of works. Like I think it it fits. Like Victor Arvidsson should have a better time in Edmonton than he did in LA, and I thought he was pretty okay in LA. So I expect Arvidsson to have. If you're in a deep fantasy league, Victor Arvidsson might be a really good pickup for you. Well, aside from that, I mean, the bottom six was also really good. I mean, you saw it in the playoffs last year. Janmark, Nugent Hopkins, and Corey Perry. Corey Perry now has obviously lost the step from where he was even at, like in the year he went to the finals with Montreal. I think he's obviously not the same player that he was even then, and even then he wasn't nearly the same player that he was in his prime, obviously. But Corey Perry's still like a serviceable third, fourth liner. Probably rather have him on the fourth line. I think he does end up getting booted down to the fourth line for Matt Savoie at some point. And you have Derek Ryan, Adam Henrique, and Savoie. And again, like you're talking about a team here that's just extremely deep. Like there's no they don't have any D or lower players on this, like on their main roster. They have a bunch of C minuses, but again, like the C minuses are offset, right? Because you have like Nugent Hopkins down there, who's really solid and kind of can elevate those players like a Yanmark and like a Corey Perry and like a Derek Ryan. You have Adam Henrique on the fourth line who can elevate guys on that line. So even when this team is weak, they have guys all throughout this lineup that can help elevate those players. And like I think Matt Savoie is going to be somebody to watch because he could pop just based on the fact that he's really not going to have a lot of responsibility. He's not going to be given a lot of like difficult roles, and I think that could be very successful for him. But he's also going to have a decent opportunity to like be a contributing member of this team. And, maybe he's somebody you throw on a power play line with McDavid and Draisaitl just to like give him that confidence, right? Like you have with the amount of dynamic talent that this Oilers team has up front, right? Like in Hyman, Hopkins, and obviously McDavid and Draisaitl, it affords you the ability to kind of experiment with everybody else around those guys. And that is such a luxury for this team because it gives you the time to kind of figure out everything, right? And this was a team that started off the year atrociously bad last year, and most of that was due to their terrible shooting percentage, right? Like all their underlying numbers were there, they just weren't scoring, and that didn't bother me at the time. I was very adamant on the fact that I think Edmonton's going to turn it around when they were like the worst team in the NHL, and they did clearly. So again, this is an offense that even if they get off to a bit of a sluggish start because they're trying to move guys around, obviously there was a bit of change in the personnel after this summer. So expect them maybe to start off a little slow again. It wouldn't worry me unless like their underlying numbers are just awful, but I don't see that happening. So overall, like it's one of the strongest units in the league pretty easily, and uh, I don't foresee any real issues with this offense aside from injuries, obviously. But assuming everybody's fully healthy, it's going to be one of the best offenses in the league again, and there shouldn't be too much pushback on that. I don't think from many people. Moving on to the blue line, I have ranked 11th, and that's higher than I thought it was going to be. But again, it's a solid enough group. I think losing Philip Broberg and giving away Cody Ceci does hurt it. Evan Bouchard, first of all, is one of the best offensive defensemen in the NHL. He's shown that this last year. He's one of the best power play defensemen in the NHL. His ability just to quarterback that power play. Obviously, it's not a very hard power play to quarterback, but he does it very effectively, and that's all we can really judge him on. His underlying numbers on the power play are fantastic. His underlying offensive numbers are fantastic. Defensively, he leaves a lot to be desired, but that's why you pair him with a Matthias Ekholm, who is one of the best two-way defensemen in the NHL and has been for basically since he entered the league. And these two together just kind of work perfectly together. Like I think it's a worse version of what like Ottawa was running out when they had Eric Carlson and Mark Mathot. Um, I think Matthias Ekholm right now is significantly better than Mark Mathot was, and Evan Bouchard is not what prime Eric Carlson was. So it kind of like it's a similar dichotomy in that case where you have kind of more of your stay at home, does everything really well kind of defenseman with your like high octane offensive guy. And it worked last year and it's worked pretty much since they brought in Matthias Ekholm. And I don't foresee that really becoming a problem anytime soon. I think the biggest pushback I'm going to get with these ratings, at least defensively, is Darnell Nurse, mostly because of how bad his playoffs were. Um, but in a similar vein to like Seth Jones, right? I think people need to, when they're evaluating his on ice play, they need to put the contract aside. And the contract was brutal when he signed it. And I'm not arguing, I'm not defending the contract at all. But this is a defenseman who's over the last 2 years been 48th in offensive or in even strength goals above replacement. He's been near the top in expected goals for. His offensive numbers are pretty good. His point total has been solid. His defensive play is pretty well league average across the board based on like any metric you use. He's not a bad defenseman. He's just overpaid. And I understand the pushback from Oilers fans on that, right? I understand the underrated of Darnell Nurse because he's overpaid. And it's the same thing that happened to Seth Jones, right? Like all of a sudden now Seth Jones is an underrated defenseman because he's actually pretty solid, but he's not worth 9 million or whatever he's getting. And it's the same thing here, right? Like Darnell Nurse is your third best defenseman is totally fine, and it's pretty good, right? Like the top three on this team is very good. Having Bouchard, Ekholm, and Darnell Nurse being your top three, that's fine. It's just the fact that Darnell Nurse is the highest paid of those three. That's the problem. Um, so I think if you can separate the contract from who Darnell Nurse is as a player, he's actually like a pretty solid number three defenseman. He's a very good number three defenseman, but it's just you need to be able to separate those two. And if you can, then you'll kind of understand my point. If you can't, then it's gonna be a lot of he should be an F in the comments. Other than that, I mean Brett Kulak is like the best third pair defenseman in the NHL. Like actual like his role should be third pair defenseman in the NHL. He rocks. He does like he really doesn't have a lot of flaws in his game. Not a huge offensive player, but like he's always been this really solid like third pair kind of guy. He was in Montreal too, and I loved him there, and I've loved him so far in Edmonton. Again, maybe a little bit overpaid, but for what he's asked to do on the ice, he does it very well. I do have concerns about Emerson and Stetcher, and I think this is a case where we might see some of the Oilers' depth come up. I really hope that depth isn't Brown because he would be worse. Um, but I do expect Brown to play it quite a bit just because he brings that like physical, like tough guy edge that he's going to hit everybody and people are going to love that and they're going to go crazy. But he's actually not a very good hockey player. Um, and that concerns me a little bit because I think the depth on this blue line is definitely the weakest part of it. And if they can even go out and acquire a defenseman at some point, then that would be helpful. That would be kind of be my priority as of now looking at this team is go out and acquire a defenseman. Moving into net, they rank tied for 10th for me, and I feel like I'm going to get some pushback on the Stuart Skinner ranking as well. But Stuart Skinner over the last 2 years is 8th in goals saved above expected. He ranks right beside like Jordan Binnington and Tristan Jarry. For me, like if I were to rank goalies, he's in that same group. And same with Binnington and Jarry, as I talked about in Pittsburgh and St. Louis's video. They're goalies who their highs are extremely high and they can look like the best goalie in the world at times. And their lows drop them down significantly. And I think, their actual overall value is somewhere in the middle. And we saw that in the playoffs too, right? Like Stuart Skinner had like the worst start ever in the history of the playoffs through like two rounds. And then in the finals, like he was outside of Connor McDavid, he was probably the main reason why they forced 7 games in that series. So that's kind of what I mean with Stuart Skinner. He's incredibly inconsistent. If he can find consistency, then that would be great. If he can't, then he might be somebody who slides a little bit in the rankings. But overall, like if you look at his full body of work over the last 2 years, I mean, he's eighth in goal state above expected. Like he deserves to be in the A- tier. He's one of the top like 12, 13 goalies in the NHL. And I feel pretty confident in saying that. As for his backup, Calvin Pickard stepped up. He had a fantastic season last year, especially based on what he was asked to do. Just by virtue of the fact that he played like I think it was like 25 games last year, and he didn't play the year before. I couldn't go higher than a C minus. I was very tempted even just to. I was it was hard for me to put him above a D just because of that games played cap, but he played well enough in the role that I had to boost him up to C minus. But just games played is what really hurt Calvin Pickard there. If he can, I have concerns that the 25 game sample size isn't very big and he didn't play the year before. So who knows what he's going to be? It's a very big question mark. And that could be another issue for this team is maybe, they're looking for a backup goalie at some point during this season. But overall, like, I mean, the top end of this team is going to be elite. And the top end of pretty much every team we talk about at this point is going to be elite. And I think the difference at this point and the gap between where we are now in the rankings and number one is so minuscule. Like it's such a small gap. Like I think there's like a 0.2 difference between Edmonton and like the team 2 spots ahead of them. Like it's not very big. But the difference is some of those teams have that depth, right? Like it's pretty much a guarantee that all these players are going to have now, not all of them have an A+ player, but most of them are going to have at least one A+ player. If not, they'll have a multiple guys in the A's. And it's just like the top end talent is there for every one of these teams at this point. The difference between Edmonton and like my number one, number two teams is the depth. And Edmonton's worst 2 defensemen scare me. And their forward core doesn't really scare me that much, but it's more so their bottom pair, I guess bottom 4 defensemen, 3 out of their bottom 4 defensemen. 2 other, I guess, aside from Kulak, and their backup goaltender is what I'm trying to say, right? Like those are 3 big holes. Those are 3 holes, and they're not big holes because they're 2 worst defensemen and their backup goalie. But at this point, when you're talking about teams at this level of the NHL, those are the things that are going to separate you from being, near 10 or near 1 in my rankings. And unfortunately for Edmonton, those 2 questions, which don't seem very big compared to some of the questions we've talked about with teams throughout the series, but at this point, they matter. And as you're kind of going down the stretch and you're battling for playoff position, you're battling for a Stanley Cup, all those little things matter. And they're very solvable issues. They're not unsolvable things for the Oilers, but they're there and they're there right now. So for me, like obviously this team's in the Stanley Cup bubble. Like I said in my Vegas video, everybody Vegas onwards is in my Stanley Cup contenders bubble. The Oilers are just a little bit further away than some of the other teams, in my opinion, as of right now. But yeah, I really like this roster. I don't want to make it sound like I don't. I'm very much nitpicking these teams at this point because everybody like in the top 10 is a phenomenal team. But let me know what you think of the Edmonton Oilers in the comments down below, and make sure you like and comment and subscribe. And we will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.